Talk about anxiety next time, and we'll talk about some different subtypes of depression, not just seasonal affective disorder, but some others too. So we'll cover some of these things today, and again, it's kind of a packed outline. I tried to make it as brief as I could, but as usual, I'll try to keep the comments to a minimum, so there's lots of room for questions. But stop me at any time. I don't mind being interrupted. So we'll start off. First of all, I should probably recap a little bit about what is depression. Remember, we did a talk on depression, but we call it clinical depression, or major depression is the other word for it. And remember that major depression it's a cluster of symptoms. We don't have a way other than just talking to someone to figure out, to diagnose it. So no blood tests, no scans, brain scans, or things like that. But it's a cluster of symptoms, usually a down, depressed mood. And also then loss of interest in a lot of things that you used to enjoy, or most things you used to enjoy. These two things occur most often, almost every day, for at least 2 weeks. Usually it's more than 2 weeks. Usually it sort of slowly kicks in and gradually gets worse and worse and worse. And over the course of a couple of months, you or the family member notice that there's something wrong. So in addition to the depressed mood and the lack of interest in things, there can be energy changes, changes in energy level, changes in sleep patterns. You can also have appetite changes. And when I say changes, I mean either up or down. So those things can be either dramatically increased or decreased. A lot of guilt and worthless feelings. Folks with depression are very pessimistic. Everything, everything looks negative. The world and the relationships, work, everything just is very negative. And unfortunately, a certain number of people will get so depressed that they kind of don't feel so much like life is worth living anymore. It just feels like they'd rather be out of their misery and not have to deal with it anymore. And sometimes that ends up resulting in suicide. So that's really the danger with major depression. Now remember, there's different ways you can get major depression, right? There's major depressive disorder. That's where you get a depressed episode like I just described that interferes with your function, but you don't have any other like bipolar disorder or anything else that's causing it. It's just depression. Then there's bipolar disorder, where you have these mood swings of manic, where you go high in your mood, and then depressed, where you go low in your mood. And there's different, there's things like schizoaffective disorder. I don't know if you've ever heard of schizoaffective disorder. I know some people have. It's like a combination, really, of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And you can get a depressed episode as part of that, too. So there's multiple ways to get a depressed episode. And then within depression, there are subtypes within depression. So, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So you can have subtypes of depression that have sort of unique symptoms that go along with the depression, such as major depression with psychosis. We're going to talk about that tonight. Then you can also have depressed episodes that occur at certain times of the year over and over in sort of a cycle, and that can be like seasonal affective disorder. That's another subtype. And you can also have depression that occurs with some other sort of regular event. So after a mother delivers a baby, for instance, that's called postpartum depression. Or you can have it after, premenstrually, and that's called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So these are all types of depression, and let's talk now about what makes them different. One of the things I thought I'd do is to describe some of these things. It may make it a little more real if I describe some cases. I've often thought in here it'd be nice if I had a TV screen or some way to show actual cases, of how folks look when they're depressed and when they're not, or when they're manic and when they're not. Because those things are dramatic and pretty easy to see for everybody. The problem with that is, as you know, there's confidentiality, and so I don't know that that's going to happen. But I'll keep my eyes open. If I happen to see any tapes or anything like that, I'll certainly bring them in, because I think they're very instructive. So I guess the first thing, let's talk about major depression with psychosis. And this first case, we'll describe it. Now, these cases aren't real cases. I mean, they're basically little pieces of real cases. It's kind of how it is. So don't worry about confidentiality. But for our sake, we'll talk about this first case. He's a middle-aged male, and he's diagnosed with he's diagnosed with cancer, and he becomes clinically depressed. He starts getting into one of these depressive episodes, major depression. Okay. He gets sleep problems, he stops eating, and can't concentrate, feels worthless and guilty. He happens to be a spiritual man, and his faith is one that does not believe in seeking modern medical treatment for illness. So he gets, but he's got a family member that doesn't have the same spiritual belief and convinces him, you got to go see a doctor, you got cancer, you got to get treatment, this is treatable, talks him into it, he goes and gets treatment from the physician, and his cancer actually goes into remission. So cancer's not even the issue anymore. But his depression continues, okay, and with the lack of sleep, he starts to feel like that he's sinned and that God is punishing him for seeking treatment. And that he's condemned him to death. God has condemned him to death. He's losing dangerous amounts of weight at this point. This gentleman's not eating very much at all. This is an example of major depression with psychosis. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that particular this cluster of symptoms before we go into more detail? These cases can be kind of difficult because the person usually doesn't realize that they have a problem. They usually, one of the things we should talk about is what is psychosis. We talked about it a couple times here before. It's kind of a fancy word, and I think maybe sometimes it's a little hard to understand what it is. But basically, in a nutshell, it's just when you're not thinking in reality. So if your mind is, I tell people, the way I put it is, your mind plays tricks on you, okay? But understand that you don't realize it's playing tricks on you. I mean, you don't think it's playing tricks on you. At the time, when you're psychotic, you see certain things and you're convinced that they're there. They look very real to you, just as real as I look standing in front of you now. So there are different types of psychosis. There's hallucinations. Have you heard of hallucinations, everybody? Hallucinations can be any type of sense that you have. So it can be, you could have a visual hallucination, and that's something that you see that other people can't see. You can have an auditory hallucination, which is where you hear something that other people can't hear. And, you can even have olfactory hallucinations, where you're smelling something that nobody else can smell. You can have tactile hallucinations, where you feel like, you've heard of people feeling like bugs are crawling on their skin, but there aren't any. That's a tactile hallucination. So hallucinations are more sensory, I guess. That's the way I put it. Delusions with a D, those are thoughts that something's happening when it isn't. So it's, to give you an example, perhaps the FBI is, somebody becomes convinced that the FBI is bugging their phones and tracing them everywhere they go. And, that's a paranoid delusion, usually. I mean, I suppose the FBI really could be. Now, and interestingly enough, that's kind of the difficult part, is figuring out, is this something that's really going on or not? And a lot of times delusions are things that are fairly believable, and so it's hard for the physician and the family sometimes to realize if it's, to know if it's really a psychotic symptom or if it's is reality. One of the ways you can tell is that when somebody gets a psychotic thought, it's on their mind all the time. They cannot get it off. It's like a broken record. So the first thing they think about when they get out of bed in the morning, and let's use this gentleman as an example, that he's condemned to die by God. So the first thing he thinks about, and all he thinks about all day long, is this thought. And he's convinced he's going to die. And what's the sense in eating? If you're convinced you're going to die, you don't need to eat, right? And plus he doesn't have an appetite from his depression. So that's one other way to tell if it's psychosis or not, is if it's on the mind all the time like that. That's a little clue or a warning sign that could be psychosis. Now, when somebody gets depressed and then gets psychotic, a lot of times the psychosis will go along with the depressive theme. Okay, so maybe it's it's feeling like you're responsible for a loved one's death, for instance, and that's a delusion. I mean, you didn't cause the loved one to die, but they died, and in your mind you did something to cause it, and that could be a delusion. Being punished for some perceived wrong, like this gentleman in the example I gave. He feels like he's done something wrong and he's being punished for it. Probably he hasn't. I mean, and